Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ninth and last Engage webinar in which we assess the European Union's strategic response to the invasion of Ukraine 2 years into the full-scale invasion. My name is Gustavo Miller. I'm senior researcher at the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven in Belgium, which is partner of the Engage Consortium. As most of you know by now, Engage is an Horizon 2020 project that looks into how the European Union can effectively and sustainably meet strategic challenges by utilizing all of its external action tools and by consequence become a more assertive global actor. On June 12th, the Engage project will release a white paper on the European Union's external action that puts together 3.5 years of insightful research and turns that into useful and actionable recommendations for the EU to recalibrate its role and place in a changing global order. You can know more about Engage and its upcoming white paper and various policy briefings by checking its website. That's engage-eu.eu. Now to today's topics that hardly needs any introduction. In February 2022, Russia initiated its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, marking arguably the most significant event in European geopolitics since the end of the Cold War, at least. Standing with Ukraine, the European Union's response has been multi-layered, encompassing sanction packages aiming at diminishing the Russian capacity to wage war, enhanced defense cooperation, humanitarian aid, and comprehensive aid packages to Ukraine that include financial support and military equipment. Furthermore, the EU has initiated enlargement negotiations with Ukraine, now having a candidate status, signaling a deep commitment to supporting Ukraine during the crisis. But of course, the EU's response is not without criticism. The response is often considered to be slow or insufficient, or sometimes even both, given the Union's commitment and what is at stake in the conflict. Today's panel's discussion will assess the European Union's response to the conflict, taking stock of the actions taken so far, identifying the obstacles and drawing some lessons that will shape the future of the European Union's foreign policy. Now, to discuss all of this, it's my pleasure to welcome the speakers. Alexander Brzozowski is Global Europe and Defense Editor at Euractiv. Nicole Kenny is Head of Policy at the Munich Security Conference, and Łukasz Maślanka is a Senior Fellow at the Center for Eastern Studies, OSW. Thank you all three for being with us here online today. I suggest that we start with Nicole with a focus on the defense cooperation side, followed by Łukasz, and finishing with a view from the media coverage of the events with Alexander. Each of our panelists will give an initial talk of around 8 minutes. That will be followed by a Q&A. As usual, you, the audience, can ask questions in the written format. First come, first served. You're going to find the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again to all three of you. Without further ado, Nicole, for your initial intervention, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Gustavo, for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm joining you from Berlin, and as you said, I'm going to focus on the EU's response in the field of defense. And as you also just said, Gustavo, there has been a lot of criticism, and I think Macron put it quite well in his recent Sorbonne speech when he actually said on the response in the field of defense that we have begun to wake up, but that this awakening is still too slow and still too weak. And I'm going to go a bit through the statement. So first, really starting with signs that Europe has begun to wake up. And I think here two elements are interesting. The first one is defense investment. Now, if we look back at the past 2 years, we can see that member states have announced really significant increases in defense spending. 20 EU member states have announced increases of their national budgets. And we did the math last year, and we realized that if actually these promises materialized, that would mean that combined European defense budgets would increase by 61% by 2028, or in other words, 400 billion euro compared to pre-war forecasts. At the same time, we have also heard NATO Secretary General earlier this year stating that 18 members, NATO members, are expected to meet the 2% defense spending target this year. So quite significant increases and also in the short term. Among them, of course, Germany meeting the first time the 2% target this year. So that's defense investment, a lot of increases, a reversal of a trend before 2014. We had already seen increases, but now we're going to see even more. The second part is defense cooperation. And I think here, if we look back to the past, especially last year, we see that the EU has tabled a number of very innovative measures and also breaking a number of taboos. To mention just 3 examples, it's for the first time the EU obviously decided to deliver weapons military assistance to a conflict area via the European Peace Facility. This has been a major taboo also for countries such as mine, but also the Nordic states. And if you look at the amounts, we started with the European Peace Facility with a budget or volume of 5.6 billion. And now we have a total reference amount of 17 billion until 2027. So massive increase and a big cultural shift from some countries. So that's the first example. The second example that is significant is that the EU has used its budget for the first time, its budget to co-fund military procurement via the EDIRPA instrument. And again, this has been quite a cultural shift for the EU, focusing first on short-term priorities for joint procurement. A third example also related to that is the EU's ammunition initiative. So last year around, Estonia made a proposal that the EU should pool resources in order to provide Ukraine with 1 million rounds of ammunition, both from stocks, but also through joint procurement, and also to provide funds from the EU budget to ramp up ammunition production. So, looking back, a lot of new investment, fresh funding, creative defense initiatives coming from Brussels. And yet, to really share some impressions from this year's Munich Security Conference, it was really marked by a sense that Europe is actually still half asleep. This impression was due to 2 things. On the one hand, you had really desperate calls from the Ukrainians for ammunition, for long-range missiles and air defense systems. And on the other hand, you had European decision makers on stage, which were in a kind of state of self-critical frustration, as I would call it, saying, we know what should be done, long-term contracts for the industry, ramping up production, etc. But we're still doing it too hesitantly and too slowly. And many, of course, also pointed to the failure of the EU's ammunition initiative, which I just mentioned, which only delivered 1/3 of the promised rounds. So I would argue that since then, so since February, we have seen some more signs that the EU's awakening on defense is speeding up. We have seen, in particular, on the one hand, we have seen a refusal to budget longer-term funding for the EU, for example, in the European Peace Facility, to follow the proposal of Josep Borrell to engage with 20 billion for the next years. But on the other hand, we have actually seen some notable member state initiatives. We have seen the Czech initiative, to buy 800,000 rounds of ammunition for Ukraine, and including from outside of the European Union. And here also we have seen a change in approach from France, which had long pushed for a buy-European approach, also on the issue of ammunition. We also have seen a German initiative on air defense, including also the delivery of several Patriot systems, and putting some pressure on other EU member states to actually deliver air defense systems as well. So meaningful short-term initiatives by single member state, but at the same time also we have seen a supranational push coming mostly from the Commission and focused on moving these short-term crisis management measures towards the longer term. And here, of course, the Commission presented its proposal for the EU's new defense industrial strategy with very ambitious targets. So, for example, suggesting that the EU and its member states should spend half of their defense investment in Europe rather than abroad by 2030, which is very significant if you consider that in the past 2 years, the EU has spent less than 1/3 on European defense equipment. And a second key measure, just to throw it in, is the possibility to prioritize orders. And I think here it's also a lesson from the failure of the EU ammunition initiative to meet its goal. Because one of the reasons here, especially according to the Commission representatives, is that it has failed because many of the orders in the member states were already blocked to go to other countries, non-European countries, and not to Ukraine. So we have seen some initiatives, and of course, given the really difficult situation in Ukraine, it's appropriate to ask again whether Europeans are in fact now decisively waking up. And I think the jury is still out. We see some signs that things are moving more quickly, but there is still also a question for how long this will actually last. And as always in this domain, I think key issues here are funding and political will. On funding, I think it will be quite interesting to see what happens to the proposal to use the windfall profits from Russian frozen assets for military assistance to Ukraine, where we should see some movement in the coming days. But in the longer term, I think it's unclear. I mentioned initially that if these promises, if these pledges materialize of the member states, then we will have a significant increase. But I think it's unclear whether these pledges will actually materialize. And just to mention here Germany as an example, we have a national security strategy which promises that we should meet 2% goal from now on a multi-year average. But it's quite unclear how we will actually meet this goal after the special budget for defense is depleted. And to move to the European level, so we have this very ambitious European defense industrial strategy proposal by the Commission. That again is unclear how it will be funded in the future. We have now 1.5 billion for the coming years in the current EU budget, and we have proposals about Euro defense bonds. We have proposals of Commissioner Breton of a 100 billion euro fund for the next legislature. But again, a lot of resistance here from the member states, and more broadly also resistance and pushback from the member states against some of these very ambitious proposals. And just to conclude, I think in terms of political will, two push factors will be key in the coming months. The first, of course, the evolution of the situation on the battlefields in Ukraine. We have seen now in the past months that this has led to some of these short-term initiatives from the member states, but also, and perhaps more importantly, of course, the outcome of the US presidential election. We have seen a lot of focus also here in Germany on the scenario of a second Trump term and how we should be Trump-proofing NATO, Trump-proofing European security and defense. But I think it's also one overlooked aspect is also the need to actually Biden-proof European security and defense to also avoid that Europeans go back to sleep in November after a potential Biden victory. Thanks a lot, and I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for shedding light on these elements of defense cooperation. We're going to come back probably to the potential impact of the elections in the US, right? We seem to have the possibility of a negative impact with both candidates being elected, right? You just mentioned that with the Biden election, we might come back to the sleeping situation. So let's go back to that perhaps in the Q&A. And now we move on then to Łukasz. Łukasz Maślanka for the initial intervention, also a view from Eastern Europe in that sense.
Hello, thank you very much. I will start with EU military aid because it's my area of research. My assessment is that the EU has been surprisingly effective in providing military aid to Ukraine. And I think we should particularly appreciate the role of the European Peace Facility, which has become a very flexible tool for the EU to influence the political situation in its surroundings, not only in the case of Ukraine, but also in case of any future conflict. The European Peace Facility is an instrument which is very worth exploring. In the case of Ukraine, it encouraged member states to transfer the post-Soviet equipment to Ukraine, which the Ukrainians were able to deploy very quickly because they were familiarized with this kind of weapon. The EPF also proved to be a mechanism for internal solidarity among member states. States donating arms were given a financial incentive to do so, while states unable to donate were able to contribute financially. And one can only regret that this mechanism was somewhat spoiled by the recent negotiations. I'm referring in particular to some member states' efforts to ensure that member states would be able to deduct their bilateral assistance from the EPF contribution. Another important EU contribution to military assistance to Ukraine is the training mission, EU MAM Ukraine, also funded by the EPF, and I hope that recent changes to the EPF do not result in a shortage of money to continue this essential mission that has so far trained about 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers, if I'm not mistaken. The training happens mainly in Germany and Poland, and the instructors are European officers, mainly from Germany, Poland, France, Spain. As Nico already said, less successful were the EU efforts to provide Ukraine with 1 million artillery shells. It is clear that the European arms industry has not switched to a war economy mode. And while European initiatives such as ASAP, EDIRPA, and EDIP can help, increasing production will only be possible through political decisions by member states to increase military spending and to put massive orders. The US military budget is $800 billion. The military budget of all EU countries is 270 billion euros. And I'm very concerned about the tendency of some member states and some European political parties to use European Commission's initiative to support the arms industry to cover up their unwillingness to increase arms spending. We can read it, for example, in the program of the European Greens or the Social Democrats, that instead of increasing our spending, we should rather cooperate. Cooperation doesn't replace increasing of military spending. And this has to happen at member state level. The role of the EU is limited here. Without more money and long-term orders, the European arms industry will not produce in sufficient quantities and at quicker pace to meet current security threat and Ukraine's needs. Another point is sanctions. While the EU has put in place an unprecedented number of sanctions against Russia, it has been much worse at implementing them. It seems to me that a discussion is needed on the creation of an EU watchdog to keep an eye on compliance with sanction regimes. And this watchdog also should have tools to punish those companies and countries that violate sanctions. I'm referring here to countries and companies both inside and outside the EU. And also it was a fatal mistake from today's perspective to discuss so long the oil embargo and then to set the embargo introduction date several months in advance. This led to a massive price spike in 2022, which provided Putin with war funding for the next few years. Now, if the situation of the Russian economy is not as bad as we expected, it's also because of these incomes from 2022 oil price spike. And the oil price ceiling is also not functioning properly. It should be lowered, and second-tier sanctions should be introduced against states and institutions that break this ceiling. Following the example of the US, the EU should launch sanctions on banks in third countries that make it easier for Russia to circumvent sanctions. The EU and major EU economies should be careful in strengthening relations with Central Asian countries. While this seems politically justified, these countries are the easiest way for Russia to circumvent sanctions because they are in customs union with Russia. So if we increase our trades with Central Asian states, we also increase the risk of Russia circumventing sanctions. Another important issue in the debate around Russian-Ukrainian war is the issue of the global south. And it seems to me that the concern of some European countries about the lack of support from the global south against Russia stems mainly from a concern for their own image in these countries. This concern is justified by the commercial interests. In fact, the situation from the Cold War period is being repeated. The West won the Cold War without the global south. It is the countries of the global south that should worry about their image and consider what will happen if Russia and China start to violate international law against them as openly as Russia did against Ukraine. So I think that the current situation, when a nuclear power is allowed to violate international law, should not be accepted by the global south in global south best interest. Another issue that is a result of this war is a push to EU institutional reforms. Some member states believe that the recipe for a better EU response to events such as the war in Ukraine is institutional reform, including a move away from unanimity in the common foreign and security policy. I believe this is a wrong way. It has been also frustrating from Poland's point of view to negotiate changes to the EPF or further sanction packages with very difficult partners inside the EU. But this seems necessary. Creating a situation in which a certain group of member states will notoriously feel excluded from the decision-making process is a recipe for the implosion of the EU and not for a success. And I think also that the June EP elections will bring an increase in the importance of Eurosceptic forces. And one of the reasons, a part of the Green Deal, will be this push of some member states for institutional reforms. And the last issue, transatlantic relations. The Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrated the indispensability of the US role in maintaining European security. The US virtually saved Ukraine with its military aid. Of course, the Americans also made many mistakes. For example, the excessive fear of escalation. One can say that Biden practically encouraged Putin to invade Ukraine with his assurances that not a single American soldier would stay in Ukraine in case of war. And also the debates of the latest aid package brought a major blow to the credibility of the United States. Europe should strengthen its weight in NATO, and the best way to do this is to increase arms spending and modernize the armed forces of European countries and prepare the armies of the European countries for a high-intensity conflict scenario. Looking at the modernization efforts of major Western European armies, I don't see it. So I think that they remain in a model of expeditionary army. We see it in France, in Italy, in the United Kingdom, which is outside the EU. And what will happen with the German army, I'm not sure. At the same time, it must be highlighted that the CSDP and the EU are not fit to act as a separate military alliance, and pursuing this way would be a waste of time. Even if we were to imagine a catastrophic scenario of the EU's leaving Europe, NATO will remain a collective security alliance in which EU countries will interact with such important partners as the UK, Canada, and Norway. European countries, especially those on the eastern flank, will have to get along with any US administration because for us, scenario of defending Europe against Russia without the United States is simply impossible to imagine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vushak, for covering so clearly so many topics. Right, I would like to come back to a few of those in the Q&A, but in particular, the reflection on sanctions, right, and whether they have worked or produced any impact as it was forecast at the beginning, and also this idea that on these reflections on the support from the global south, right, which I found particularly interesting as well. The EU has been struggling to convince or to bring global south countries to its side. And you argue that perhaps that's so much of it's also in the global south interest to do so. Now let's move on then to Alex. Alex has been quite a few times in Ukraine as well. I wonder if you can perhaps bring a little bit of their the mood there or their perspective together with some reflections on the EU's response. Alex, the floor is yours.
Sure. Hello. Thanks very much. Apologies for my voice. I hope it will work. I'm going to be looking at the EU's response to the crisis from a more journalistic view, and maybe also look a bit more at the public debates that we have at the moment in terms of what trends to watch in the next coming months. So in addition to what Nicole and Łukasz already said about the defense policy aspects, let me maybe mention three main points that are key when looking at Europe from the whole, how Europe responded to the war in the first place. Because I think the first main point is that this was really not an unexpected war, and we technically should stop referring to it as such, which still sometimes is the case. For the 8 whole years prior to the Russian invasion, many EU policymakers were especially here in Brussels, but also in capitals, have not called the war by its real name, and instead they have kept referring to it as the Ukrainian crisis or similar wordings. And in some way, obviously the media are part of that problem as well, or at least those that were not paying attention enough maybe to the way they were reporting about it. But this came with the implication that this is not our war. It happened somewhere else at the fringes of Europe. We can really do nothing about it. And that narrative, I think we saw playing out in the whole Ukraine support debate over the past few months, and whether the West is still committed to Ukraine. So that kind of is the successor of that, in my view. And that narrative also partly led to the situation where the warnings that happened at that time were mostly dismissed and not taken fully seriously. And maybe one example that was very striking to me was when we were reporting in the Donbas region along the contact line, maybe 2-3 weeks before the invasion. We were doing a story on the failing Minsk agreements back then. But what we essentially understood then is that if the EU and its member states had listened a bit closer back then to not only the Americans, that too, but to their own ambassadors and experts they had in Kiev and Moscow, the response might have been a bit more nuanced than it was in the days before. And it might sound like stating the obvious a bit, but the reason why I'm mentioning this specifically is because this is probably one thing that we see changing slowly but steadily in Brussels and in the EU institutions. There seems to be a stronger push towards improving situational awareness, information sharing inside the institutions, be it the EAS or other places, which is really a change that we saw when it comes to the way we reporters were briefed on the course of this war. So it also is part of the bigger consequence that Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed Europe's center of gravity more towards the east. I mean, we see voices from the Baltics and Central Europe have gotten more importance and are better represented now in all the EU debates. And that's also probably one of the lessons learned that we will see quite visible in Brussels when we think about the top job debate. I think that's maybe one of the main key events where we will see Eastern Europeans playing a stronger role than they might have if the invasion wouldn't have happened. The second point is that the speed of Europe's response on the day and the days following the invasion was something that surprised everyone, maybe especially us reporting from Brussels every day, since before that we often faced a rather slow and opaque response when there were crises. And adding to that speed, and I think Nicole mentioned also the number of taboos that have fallen since then, including the peace facility, buying arms for Ukraine, the sanctions, and the discussions that we have now about EU bonds for Ukraine. So I think that is one of the things that probably is the most remarkable event in the past 2 years. And the third point, which is for me actually the key one to watch when it comes to the response in the next few months, that when looking at European security debates at the moment, there seems to be somehow a real reckoning across Europe that things cannot stay as they are. We see that with messaging on defense spending, on conscription. We see that also with Macron's Baltic turn in some way, if you want to call it like that, and other things. But suddenly, the way I think the public debate has shifted towards resilience and preparedness in more practical terms, I think is quite a change, and it's a relatively new change. Because the main vulnerability in EU structures, I think, was often the way that we're talking about resilience, which was very abstract. Usually, I mean, for us reporters, our toenails were rolling up sometimes when policymakers were using that as a buzzword, not explaining what exactly it is that they mean with it or how this would translate in practical terms. So part of that change is also this mindset that we will need to invest money in all those things that my fellow panelist also mentioned before. Not only the defense industry or enlargement as such, but also simple strategic communication. And we saw that also partly maybe now with the latter report that dealt with more maybe internal market issues and competitiveness. We will see that even stronger with Draghi's report and the strategic agenda discussion that EU leaders will have in June. And that is expected to map out the priorities for the next 5 years, that especially defense industry enlargement will play a very strong role in the next commission. But I think one important thing here, and circling back to that resilience and preparedness discussion, is that not only the EU, but especially I think European publics will be facing not only an economic and political challenge, but it will be mostly also a cultural challenge and probably also a psychological one. And here I agree with Nicole and Łukasz. The main question will be looking at how the EU elections, the US elections will kind of be influenced by the course of the war and the need for crisis management while those leadership decisions are made. Because I think that's the main worry at the moment in Brussels, that we will be in the middle of the elections in June, and suddenly we will probably have to also deal with a larger Russian advance in Ukraine. And then it will be very interesting to see how both of those issues can be reconciled in the meetings. And obviously for journalists, that will be the main thing to watch, how this can be, well, crisis managed at the same time. Yeah, maybe I stop here and then we can move to questions.
Thank you so much, Alex, especially for this last reflection on the elections. I think it's not only elections seems to, the result of the upcoming elections will have an impact on the way that Europe is responding to the crisis, but in a way the crisis is also part of the elections, if only because also there is a Russian disinformation campaign that targets both of the elections that we also keep mentioning in Europe and in the United States as well. We are receiving a few questions in the chat. I also have a few questions from my own, abusing my role as moderator here. And I would like to come back to this idea that the European Union's response has been insufficient, which seems to be a consensus in our debate so far. It was quite fast at the beginning, as Alex just said, but rather insufficient. Why do you think that this is the case? Is it a matter of the institutional design of the European Union, sort of lack of competence in there, or lack of political will that Nicole mentioned? Is it a lack of resources, or sort of the legacy of decades of underspending in defense? Or is it perhaps sort of that there's no public support backing that shift, right? And here, this last element sort of ties up to the one of the questions that we have in the chat right now, which is from Plamen Pantev. I'm hoping I pronounced that right. Basically, the person says, how to bring the European societies to the realities of the developing war in Ukraine for now? What should be done to send a strong signal that Europeans are ready for sacrifices as the Ukrainians are? So it ties up with this idea of public support, right? Is the European public there yet in terms of the shift that's operating in European security and defense? So basically a question it's a general one, right? Try to identify the reasons why the European response has been insufficient and what can be done about it, right? Shall we go through this first question in the same order, perhaps? So we're starting with Nicole.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I think you mentioned a lot of the reasons why we have been too slow. I think also if I look at my country, we have been faced with years of underspending. When the war started, then actually the stocks were empty for many of the material, much of the equipment that was needed, whether it's ammunition, whether it's also tanks, was limited. And that's, of course, a result of the past. So then you have the situation that indeed actually had a lot of strong support for increasing defense spending, for responding decisively to that, at least also here in Germany. But then, you first have to manage to spend all that money and to build up the production capacities. And I think then that has been one of the key issues with ammunition, not only in Europe, by the way, also in the US, that this idea to ramp up production capacities quickly, it didn't quite work out that way. And one of the reasons that is always mentioned by the defense industry was the case last year's Munich Security Conference, this year's Munich Security Conference, is always that the industry says we need long-term contracts in order to actually make these investments to ramp up production capacities now, because we don't know what will happen to our orders in the future. And this is where I think the idea of the European Ammunition Initiative was a good one, to actually pool the demand and say, we give you this long-term perspective, all of us together, that we will actually spend this money, regardless of the situation in Ukraine, and that you can now also start ramp up production immediately. So I think that happened, but to a limited degree, too little, too late. And this idea of priority orders, the Commission had already tabled that in last summer, but was rejected by the member states, as again it's seen as a power grab by the Commission or as an encroachment on competences. And here, that's the other issue. If you take the EU level, of course, there's a limitation as to what the EU can do. Also because of limited competences in the field of defense, especially the Commission has competences in the field of industrial competitiveness, but not defense proper. And just to perhaps link that to something that Lukáš was saying, I think it's wrong, of course, if certain member states hide behind this idea of more cooperation as an excuse to not invest. I think both are necessary. You need to invest more, and you need to invest more together. And you need the European Union and the power of the market in order to push for more standardization, because we have seen also that these multiple models of ammunition, of tanks, are also causing a real problem for Ukraine. And just to finish up on the question of societies, I think that so far actually the backing has been quite strong. And that there has been continued support behind delivering weapons to Ukraine, as well as actually increasing defense spending. But I think we are seeing that this support is probably going to drop, because as perhaps Russia's war is dropping out of the media a little bit more, and perhaps because it's perceived as far away, and because there are other priorities, whether it's social spending. So I see that the danger is more now, and I think we're seeing it already happening in the US to an extent.
Thank you, Nicole. Hence also the importance of what will happen in the terrain in Ukraine over summer, right? To see how the public opinion will link to that in support for the country. Łukasz, other than the questions that I already asked earlier, you also mentioned this interesting practical recommendation on having a sanctions watchdog, right? Which I found very interesting. We know that there is plenty of ways to circumvent the sanctions, but I wonder if you could also elaborate on that, on top of perhaps locating some of the reasons why the EU's response has been inefficient.
Yes, when we compare, for example, the effectiveness of the US sanctions and the EU sanctions, we see that the United States have a watchdog which is responsible for enforcing the sanctions, and that's why they are more effective. So we need an institution or maybe a cellule within an institution which already exists, like, for example, the EU Prosecutor Office, which employs a few dozen of persons who are expert on this area, who have some economic competence, who know how the international financial system function, and are able to check whether the sanctions the EU is imposing are enforced. But I know that this will be very, very difficult because many member states will invoke the sovereignty argument to prevent such a watchdog from being created. So as far as we are there, we have the member states who are responsible for reinforcing the sanctions, and I think that the reinforcing of these sanctions looks different in every member state. So there are different standards in Cyprus, in Belgium, in Poland, in Sweden, and all this doesn't look very, very effective for now. But I think that this idea should be pursued right now, because if sanctions became a very important instrument of shaping our foreign policy, we must have an instrument and a watchdog responsible for enforcing these sanctions. And coming to the previous question, I think we shouldn't expect too much from the European Union when it comes to defense. We must remember that in the area of defense, the EU works mainly as an intergovernmental organization, because the CSDP is not within the competence of the European Commission. The notable exception is the defense industry. And here, the EU, the European Commission, has done its job. I think that the project of EDIS, the European Defense Strategy, the European Strategy for Defense Industry, and the project of EDIP, the new instrument whose task is to help the European defense industry. So the European institution made its job, and now it's up to member states to decide whether they want to allocate a sufficient amount of money to these instruments to work properly. So we must accept that in the area of defense, the member states will want to have its final decision, because this is a logic of intergovernmental process. And the last, the public opinion. I think that everywhere in Europe, the public opinions are more or less conscious of the challenges related to Russian-Ukrainian war, but most societies don't want to aren't ready to accept the lowering of the level of life to help Ukraine, for example, or to prepare for a war with Russia. So we must find some way to explain to our societies that sometimes it's necessary to give up, for example, a part of social welfare in order to prepare for geopolitical challenges on which also our level of life depends. Maybe it's easier here in Eastern Europe, because in Poland, people still are conscious that their children will have a better life than there. And I think that the Western Europe, which has reached a very high level of life and of social welfare, people don't have this conviction that their children will live better than they live. And I think this main difference which makes Eastern Europe, or at least Poland, Baltic states, societies, more keen to accept that the high military spending, because it doesn't have a direct impact on their level of life.
Thanks. Łukasz. It's certainly not an homogeneous continent in terms of the society and the public support in there. Alex, I wonder if you can order also then the questions that have been circulating so far. Also shed a little bit of light on the perspective from Ukraine in terms of what they have been expecting from the European Union this last 2 years and a half, more or less.
Yes, sure. I just would follow up very quickly on what Łukasz said, because I think he said a very important thing there. One minister we were talking to quite recently, and which name I cannot disclose, but he put it even more radically, saying we need to renegotiate the social contract in the long term. And I think that's exactly the start of the debate that we kind of see at the moment. Maybe that is a bit too radical for the discussion at the moment, but that's kind of the trend that I think we're going towards. And also on the Eastern European response of things, I think that has also a lot to do with the way some of the countries have dealt with this exact resilience issue already way before the invasion happened. And this comes down to, media literacy to fight disinformation. I think that's one of the biggest things that we will be looking at in the coming months. Or, territorial defense training for students that are interested in it. All those things were kind of quite crucial when you look at the Ukrainian response and how strategic communication has been done by the Ukrainians, and also on the national level, how resilience was enforced. So I think that's something definitely to look a bit closer at. On the expectations from the Ukrainian side, I think, I've been traveling to Ukraine every 2-3 months since the invasion started and also before. But I think the key expectations that they have is EU accession. So in some way, yes, Western support when it comes to military support and financial support. But I think the key really issue in the next few months will be how the perspective of enlargement can also be used to keep them fighting. And I think that's maybe said a bit radically, but I was there at the anniversary this year in February, and that was the first thing that everybody mentioned on the street when you ask them, what do you want? Be part of the EU in the long term. I don't think there's illusions that this can happen tomorrow or in the next few years, but I think having that perspective and keeping an honest perspective will help quite a lot to, manage expectations as well in the long term. But that's the one thing that I see as the main, key issue next to the other issues.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We have still a couple of questions in the Q&A, and of course the audience can ask further questions as well. One of the issues raised is the particular sort of a role of certain member states as sort of stumbling blocks in the unified European response, right? We have talked already about some national examples, such as the case in Germany. I think Nicole was the one to raise it. But perhaps you can also shed light on the difficulties of, let's say, bringing member states together, right? Łukasz mentioned that, of course, the European response is intergovernmental, right? Very much dependent on consensus around the member states. But is there also, and perhaps I'll add there, is there any sort of national political environment where we have, in your view, observed changes in the support, right? We know that in Poland there has been a change of government, but in a way, not much change in terms of foreign policy, right? Is there any country that you would observe that has been particularly important in either pushing forward the response or blocking it in that sense? So that would be the first question. The second question comes from an anonymous attendee, but the person asks, if you had to choose one thing that member states of the EU should do in the coming months, what would it be in terms of the defense policy, right? We have seen that there's quite a few initiatives around, right, in terms of ammunition, in terms of defense industrial strategy, and so on. But is there anything else left to be done while we wait for the, let's say, the summer developments in the theater or the US elections? Is there anything else that we can do? Nicole, I'll start with you again with these questions. You can pick and choose.
Sure, yeah, thanks a lot. I think in terms of which member states have been pushing or blocking, I think the Baltic countries have been extremely strong in pushing things forward. If you look at the share of GDP they have been spending in terms of bilateral assistance to Ukraine, it's very striking, and it's very different, for example, to Southern European countries. I looked at the numbers, and I think Estonia, in terms of share of GDP, is spending 22 times more than Greece and Italy. And that's only the spending side. So in terms of initiatives as well, I think it's not a coincidence that the ammunition initiative was tabled by Estonia, the first one, the second one by Czechia. So I think we have seen a lot of leadership, and then we also have seen, I don't remember who said it, but we see a center of gravity moving east. And I think part of this is also seen from Germany. If one of these countries to the east actually proposes something, it's very hard for Germany to say no to it. It's harder than, let's say no to a French initiative, to put it kind of simply. So I think they have played a very strong role. In terms of laggards, or in terms of obstacles, I think it's also quite obvious that looking towards the southeast, we have one country that has played a very difficult role in terms of blocking EPF envelopes, EU enlargement, Ukraine facility, or at least seeking to block. And I think that's, coming to your point, Lukasz, that you said we should stay with unanimity. My point is really, okay, so far it has worked well. We have gotten the sanctions packages through, military assistance more or less, with few exceptions, but this is not necessarily going to stay this way. And for me, in terms of a capacity to act, especially also on sanctions, I think that a move to qualified majority voting would be necessary. Knowing that it's very difficult because we need unanimity for that. But the alternative that we're seeing at the moment is that things then actually take place outside of the European framework. That's fine for some things, but it's also missed opportunity for other things. And just in terms of the thing that should happen, I think the focus really has to be on strengthening the EU's defense industrial base, and therefore I think the defense industrial strategy is an important point. One concern is a little bit that it's going to take a while. And so I think what has to start very soon, also Lukasz, you mentioned initiatives need to be funded. So I think this discussion has to start extremely soon. We have heard proposals here and there, but nothing very concrete, and we have no consensus. And I think also with a view to the US election, to actually show that Europe is ready to share the burden or take on a greater part on Ukraine. I think this is to start a really serious discussion on that.
Thank you, Nicole. In many ways, the challenge of implementation, right, and then putting things in motion as well. Łukasz, on to you for the one thing that you believe should be done in the next few months in terms of enhancing the support to Ukraine.
Well, I think that we should follow also the example of the United States and confiscate the assets of Russian states which are now located in the Western Europe. I think that is the right thing to do to put this money at the disposition of the Ukrainians, because so far the distractions made by Russian army amount to about 1 billion of euros, if I don't remember. So only the 1/3 of this sum is covered by the Russian assets abroad, and I think it is a right and just thing to confiscate it and to give it to Ukrainians. And I think it will also give a good deterring example for other authoritarian states, also China. China invests a lot in both in the United States and Western Europe, and if China sees that Western reaction to the aggression is the confiscation of these assets, I think this was also could be treated as a deterring example to China to not to imitate Russia. So this one thing, and I would like also respond to your previous question from my parochial Polish perspective. I think the most important evolution it was what happened with Nordic countries, because before the war, when we were speaking with our Swedish, Danish, Finnish colleagues about Russia, about military threat coming from Russia, they're all saying, yes, you are right, but we don't want to say it loudly because, we want to be compared with you, with your obsession, etc., etc. And now the Nordic countries are very outspoken in sharing our security diagnosis. And I think that from our points of view in Poland, in Vilnius, in Riga, and in Tallinn, it's a very important development. As it is the entering of Sweden and Finland to NATO, but also of Denmark to the common security and defense policy of the European Union.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. Definitely worth looking at these changes brought by the Nordic countries entering NATO. You also mentioned China, right? There's a big elephant in the room. We're unfortunately not going to have time to go through that, but it's certainly one of the major players, even if far away. Alex, I'll give you the last words to point to us one or maybe two things that you'd like to see in the coming months in the EU's response.
Before I do that, I still want to address the elephant in the room because, I mean, if we speak about Hungary specifically, I think we're right. They block on many issues and they delay on many issues. But I think what we've also seen over the past few months is that they actually never fully blocked or well, how do you say that in English? Cut a decision in some way. So I think what that has shown, especially over the past few summits, was that there was a move towards more informal ways of making decisions. I mean, the infamous coffee toilet break of Orban, I think, is one good example of that. But also, when you look at the other levels of decision making, that you have this change towards passerelle clauses, towards constructive abstention. I mean, I think that's a trend that has been used more in some way in the past few months than it has ever been used in the years before. And I think reporting on that, we've seen that this has been relatively effective when it comes to making decisions and circumventing some of the roadblocks that you might have. At the same time, and just to finish on the Hungary issue, I think in some way the whole discussion about how Hungary is the irritant is also leading to a very different security discussion that some member states might be having at the moment. I mean, what we understood in the process when we were talking about the shaking EU aid in some way a few months ago, that certain security aspects were not fully addressed when Hungary was present in the room. I mean, there's a bit of a thinking as well of not fully discussing things in the framework as openly as it is, and that's mostly obviously the more Russia-hawkish countries that were very hesitant about that, and that has been especially, I think, the case in the benign format or the Eastern European format. So that's also a trend that I think might continue depending on what role Hungary might play in the long term, especially vis-a-vis Russia. And on the last point of the one thing, what could be done on defense policy, I think I would rather go on the foreign policy part of it, because that's the one decision that I'll be looking at in the next few months is who will be the next HRVP. And yes, of course, this is only kind of a mediator position or envisaged as a mediator position, but I think it's quite important to look at how the role has changed over the past mandate. When we look at Mogherini and Ashton, it was a very low-key role. Mogherini was more the think tank, global strategy person, but what we saw now is that this role is actually quite useful when it comes to the moment where you have to find that unified position. It doesn't always work. I think Gaza proved the point of how it didn't work so far. But when it comes to unity, I think having there a person that can reconcile member states' positions will be very, very important in the way going forward. Yeah.
Fantastic. So in many ways, the advice is to choose wisely the next HRVP as well. Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Nicole and Łukasz. This has been very, very enlightening. We are right on time. and we're definitely going to be keeping an eye on this topic as we move forward. This section will be available on the Engage website. There you can already find the recorded webinars on topics such as sanctions. That was from 2 years ago, by the way. Defense cooperation, trade and the geo-economic turn, transatlantic relations that we discussed also today, the EU-specific strategy, the EU space policy, and so much more. You can check the Engage website for that. Our next Engage high-level online lecture with Comfort Aero, director of the International Crisis Group, will happen in 2 weeks. You can register to this lecture on the Engage website as well. Comfort Aero will touch upon the EU's response to the crisis of democracy in Africa, and I hope to see many of you there. Thank you to all our panelists today. We really appreciate your participation. And until our next event, goodbye.